I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing, and there are now and there have always been numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel unto the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Techia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right, folks, so let's just review a bit about Shabbatai Tzvi, and let's move past Shabbatai. We spent enough time on this guy. As you can see, he's there on the left, and I think, as I mentioned a minute ago, he's this is a depiction from life. This is what he probably looked like. It's actually pretty difficult to underplay the disaster that was Shabbatanism. We're talking about a movement that basically began in 1666 and it didn't end until 1880s probably. We're talking about a movement, sort of mobile disaster inside of Judaism that led people to believe that abandoning Judaism was part of their salvation. I can't really articulate how much of a disaster that is. When people believe that converting to a religion that hates them, that actively is actively seeking their conversion to destroy their identity, that's a disaster. It's really a disaster. Now, when an individual Jew decides to convert, when an individual Jew decides to leave Judaism for reasons of conscience, that's their business and that's their right. Every Jew should be allowed to convert to whatever religion that they find they see fit. But the truth of the matter is, these people weren't converting because of a choice they were making on their own. They were converted because they were being led by people who delusionally believed in their messianic prowess and their messianic message. So in that way, I do see this as a kind of moving disaster, a train wreck that stretched over 2 centuries, basically. And Frankism was especially bad. We're talking about a situation where Jews had been systematically repressed for centuries in Poland, and then they were brought by the thousands into Catholicism. And as you can imagine, the moment they converted into Catholicism, and ditto when they converted into Islam, converting back was not an easy thing. We should not forget that converting back out of Islam you can get the death penalty. That's apostasy. That's a death penalty case. And of course, no one has to remind anyone about the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. Converting to Catholicism and then trying to convert back, it's not going to happen. This is a one-way street, and Frankism and Shabbatanism were a disaster in many ways for thousands of Jews over the course of a couple of centuries. And I think these should be considered forced conversions of a certain kind, because they were predicated on the idea of some apocalyptic pretension that things were ultimately going to come to an end really fast. And that never materialized. The end just got delayed and delayed and delayed. And secondly, the reasons why these conversions from Judaism to Catholicism or Islam, the mystical jibber jabber that underwrote them constantly changed. It was never systematic. There was never any spelled out theory about why this is supposed to happen and how it's supposed to work. You have a bunch of charismatic men at the center of this movement who benefit greatly from these conversions. Frank benefited greatly. Shabbatai, in his own way, also benefited. And this is a situation where I think these people were led into conversions that were, I think, forced by the charismatic leaders of that movement. In the same way that I don't think the people at Jonestown killed themselves. I think they were murdered by Jim Jones. I refuse to characterize what happened at Jonestown as mass suicide. That was mass murder precipitated by Jim Jones. And so I think that in many ways, these conversions were forced. They were forced by the charisma at some level of these leaders. And to be clear, an argument can be made, and I would make the argument that this is what happens when mysticism goes off the rails. This is what happens when rationalism is abandoned. This is what happens when you allow emotion and you allow fervor and mystical beliefs that you don't really understand to basically run ramshod. And at the end of the day, I'm very sympathetic to mysticism. I'm very sympathetic in many ways to Kabbalah, but this is the gutter of Kabbalah. It is mass conversions, and it is the disaster of the Shabbatian movement. Now, what's interesting about that is that given this disaster, given the extraordinarily disappointment of the Shabbatian movement, given the mass conversions that followed in the wake of Shabbatai and Frankism, Kabbalah kind of got off with a light touch. Kabbalah survived. You would think that after all this, many people who had seen the dangers of what Kabbalah could do, what Kabbalah could do unchecked, would just abandon it. They said, this whole Kabbalistic thing, this entire thing has led us into the gutter of mass conversion. We need to abandon this idea. This idea is toxic and it's dangerous. Well, they did realize it was dangerous. That's to be sure. We'll talk about that more tonight. They did realize it was dangerous, and they made safeguards. They put rails on the system to ensure that it did not go off the rails like this again. And yet, Kabbalah survived. It really got off with a pretty light touch, actually. And I think that part of the reason why is because the Shabbatian movement, you can imagine, I always imagine the Shabbatian movement as coming in like a wave. There's this huge Shabbatian wave that comes in like the tide, and then when the tide comes out, all this beautiful soil is left behind, but the water's gone. Shabbatai is the water coming in, bringing in the beautiful silt that will help to grow the new things, and then Shabbatai leaves. And what's left behind is the black earth that will ultimately grow new things. So in many ways, scholarship of a previous generation argued that Kabbalah made Shabbatai possible. I don't think that's true. I think that actually Shabbatai made Kabbalah possible. And I think that relationship is why Kabbalah is going to survive, because the Kabbalah is so much more sophisticated, it's so much more deep, it's so much more rich than Shabbatai Tzvi and the Frankists, who only ever really, aside from Nathan of Gaza, who only really ever developed the most thin, superficial, self-serving, apocalyptic version of Kabbalah that was engineered basically to deify them. And at the end of the day, the Kabbalah that they rode in on was a pretty, crap Kabbalah, with the exception of Nathan of Gaza, who I think was a very profound and deep Kabbalist. I will give that to Nathan of Gaza. But Shabbatai himself, Frank, they were never deep Kabbalists, and they were never really actually, I think, about the Kabbalistic life. I think at the end of the day, they were about themselves, and their actions proved it. And when they left, the Kabbalah could stand on its own because it didn't need them. It existed before them. It was deeper and richer than they could have possibly imagined. And thank God, in many ways, it survived them and it thrived. So tonight we talk about the Kabbalah in the aftermath of Shabbatai. And what I want to really drive home about this is I don't want to talk about this as post-Shabbatian Kabbalah, because Shabbatai Tzvi and the Frankist movement and all that stuff that we've been talking about, that's an aberration. And it was sort of like a night where everyone had, it was like a bender, everyone on a bender. They went to New Orleans, they got trashed, they did all the things, and they went back to their homes, and they shook off the bender. And so you can think about Shabbatian movement as a kind of a big bender. They went to New Orleans, they went down there, they got trashed, did coke, and they did all the things. And then when they came back home, they straightened up and it was over. And so I think of the Shabbatian movement as a kind of bender in the history of Judaism. So what happens in the immediate aftermath of 1666 when Shabbatai converts? Well, obviously the first thing that we've already talked about, there are people who are diehard believers who do everything they can to convince themselves, using every tool they have in Kabbalah and Torah, to convince themselves that Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah, no matter what. No matter if he apostatizes, no matter if he dies, no matter if the movement splits into three groups, no matter if they all have to convert to Catholicism, there's always someone out there willing to do the work of trying to convince anyone that this is true. And there are diehards in every religion. There are diehards in almost every belief system. And no matter what happens, they will convince themselves of what they want to believe. That's one camp. We spend a lot of time talking about them. They're out there. They're going to be out there into the 1880s, probably. Also, in the immediate aftermath of 1666, there were a ton of people who realized that this was a catastrophe. There were people who believed in Shabbatai. And in 1666, when he apostatized, they realized, oh man, this is really bad. And what's also critically important about this is that the people who at the very beginning of this, who realized this was a disaster, people like Menachem and Israel, those people who knew from the very beginning this was going to be a crazy thing, never did the told you so moment, so far as I know. From what I know in the history of Judaism, there's never a major I told you so moment where people gloat and people say, I told you so, and you can go jump in a river. You believed in this guy, and now you're barking back in the trees. You're barking back up my tree trying to get back in synagogue, and you were happy to pray to this idiot, and now he's abandoned you, and now what? You can go somewhere else. Go be Christian. What's incredible is the Jews and the rabbis who had seen people make this mistake welcomed them back. And to my knowledge, I don't see the told you so moment. They just didn't do that. They were very magnanimous, and they began to do the work. And what was the work? The work was, let's just pretend this never happened, right? Let's just pretend this never happened. So what did they do? The second camp, the people that realized it was a disaster, they went back to doing what they were doing before Shabbatai. They went back to the intellectual labor of trying to make Kabbalah work. That is to say, systematizing it. Trying to figure out how the Lurianic Kabbalah lines up with the Cordoverian Kabbalah. They went back to the heavy lifting of trying to do Kabbalah in a pretty systematic and careful way. Now, that's not to say that they just ignored it completely. They realized that something inside of Lurianic Kabbalah, something inside of the Kabbalistic impulse was dangerous because it had gone off the rails, folks. It had gone off the rails, crazy off the rails. And so they began slowly to think about how to implement safeguards to prevent this from happening again. This could have led to real serious problems. Can you imagine what would have happened if all those Jews would have got on those boats and began to sail into the Mediterranean to reach Palestine? It could have been terrifying. Tens of thousands of Jews could have died. They could have been denied entry into the Ottoman Empire. And who knows what would have happened? They're going to sail back to Spain? They're going to arrive as refugees in Christian Europe. This could have been a much, much, much worse than it was. And in fact, it's actually very lucky that it was only as bad as it was. So the rabbis began very carefully beginning the business of putting bumpers basically on the Kabbalah to prevent it from going off the rails again. And what do those bumpers look like? The main thing is public Kabbalistic teachings, especially advanced Kabbalah, just stopped. They just stopped. You just cannot teach people quantum mechanics if they don't understand Newtonian physics. You just can't. You cannot teach people how to weld if they've never held a hammer before. You have to, you cannot deliver these incredibly complex Kabbalistic ideas, which are incredibly easy to misinterpret, to a population of people who basically just don't even have a Torah knowledge, especially people who've been living in Christian lands who'd only recently converted back to Judaism. So they cease teaching Kabbalah publicly. They cease teaching it publicly. And now I know that makes many of us grit. That makes many of us think, oh, these elitists, how dare they hide this? Well, you got to put yourself in their shoes. These people were playing, it's like toddlers playing with fire. These people were not prepared to deal with this, and they were able to be convinced of something basically insane because they had heard all these crazy Kabbalistic ideas and they were able to basically convince themselves of this. So what ends up happening is that the first thing is that Kabbalah, public Kabbalah teaching begins to withdraw, especially technical stuff. Then a creeping kind of legalism begins to creep in. And that legalism takes the form of safeguards. You need to vet who can learn this stuff. And how do you vet? You vet them based on all kinds of other factors of stability. What do those things look like? That they're old enough. You don't teach a 13-year-old Kabbalah. You just shouldn't, according to this idea. You have to wait. How old? Maybe 40. And that was the number they settled on. And I bet folks have heard that number before. Well, do you want to teach Kabbalah to a bachelor? No, because a bachelor might get so crazily Kabbalistic that they're just married to God and they don't want to actually get married to a woman or whatever, right? From a traditional perspective. So they need to be married. They need to have a job. They need to have kids. They need something anchoring them to this world. Now, I've actually heard somewhere that Air Force pilots have to be married with kids or something like that because they don't want them getting in like $50 million, $30 million planes and flying around. The idea is they need to be anchored in this world. You can go to the other world. You can go to the Kabbalistic Ein Sof. You can go up the Sephirot, fine. But you need something anchoring you to this world. You need a job. You need kids and a wife. You need family. You cannot just be Kabbalah. That's unhealthy. So they begin to try to implement things at the community level that ensure that people who aren't mentally ill, people who aren't drunks, people who aren't they have other kinds of things, they're anchored in the world. Now, again, does that sound elitist to you? Maybe it does sound elitist. But is it reasonable? I think it's reasonable. Is it reasonable in just what happened with Shabbat Tzvi? It's very reasonable. I think it's very eminently reasonable. So again, I think it's not a bizarre idea. Third, there is a shift away in Kabbalah, away from cosmological speculation. That cosmological stuff has led to bizarre ideas about how the world got created and how Messiah became implanted in the world, like we talked about last time with the Drush Tanaim, the theory of the dragons, and messianic speculation just ground to a halt. That's over. We're just not going to do messianic speculation. By the way, that's a return to Talmud. Talmud is very clear. The Talmud says, do not speculate about the beginning. Do not speculate about the end. Speculate about now, right? Speculate about now. Don't deal with Maaseh Bereshit and do not deal with the end of the world. Deal with now. That's a return to very Orthodox Judaism. And we're going to see that when we get to Hasidism in a minute, Hasidism is the epitome of mystification, the mysticism of the now. Hasidism says the now, the now, the now, the now. What is happening right in front of your face? The literal thing, the world you're living in right now is more mystically important than what happened back then and what's going to happen later. And so Hasidism is going to pioneer the mysticism of the now. And so they really take this into great heights, and it represents part of the enormous genius of Hasidism. And so there's a shift. And what does this shift look like? There's a shift away from what's going on out here, right? Because trying to figure out what's going on out here, that was dangerous. So what's the shift? The shift is into here. The shift is into here, right? The shift is into the mind and into the heart. It's about personal piety. And so it's all about fixing you. We are not focusing our attention on trying to become Messiah anymore. That was a disaster. We're done with that. What do we do now? We now focus our attention on our inner piety. And so the shift in the Kabbalistic language is now toward inner tikkun, not messianic saving the world stuff. It's about saving you and your community. And that's when intense piety comes in the form of these things that we'll talk about in a minute, because this idea of kavanot, intense spiritual concentration, and following Jewish law very scrupulously. Remember, part of what people were very upset about with Shabbat Tzvi and the Shabbati movement was the rejection of Jewish law. And so what ends up happening is that Jewish law becomes front and center, just like it was early on. Remember, the Zohar is highly legal. The Zohar never said you can abandon the law. In fact, the Zohar is very clear that the law, that Kabbalah without the Jewish law, without Kabbalah, without halakha, is incoherent. And so in many ways, the post-Shabbatian movement is a return to Kabbalah at its roots. It's exactly divorcing Kabbalah from halakha. That was a disaster in the mind of these Kabbalists. And I tend to agree. And so this movement is a return back to the old school days of Kabbalah. So at the end of the day, Kabbalah will endure. Thank God. It deserves to endure. It should not have been, and thank God it wasn't thrown out with the baby with the bathwater. Right? I'm glad. I'm very glad of that. But we have to admit that I think the kind of safeguards that get put on Kabbalah in the aftermath of all this are not unreasonable. What's also important about this is this story sometimes gets told from a super Eurocentric perspective. Surprise, Eurocentrism, here it is. The truth of the matter also is that Kabbalistic centers are also appearing all over the Jewish world, in many places in which Shabbatanism really never took a big hold. And those places are going to be places like Morocco, places like Yemen, although Shabbatanism was very popular in Yemen and Morocco, Kurdistan, northern Iraq, Aleppo and Baghdad, also in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you'll remember, was a holdout. Jerusalem condemned Shabbatanism from the very beginning. So these centers in the Arab world, not in the European world, are going to be the first to come back online, and they're going to begin producing an enormous amount of Kabbalistic literature. Now, the sad truth of that is that a lot of that literature has been lost, especially as Jews fled Arab lands, were expelled from Arab lands in the 1950s. A lot of that literature has been lost, and most of it, to my knowledge, remains in manuscript. When I say manuscript, I mean handwritten books from the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. So there's not even printed editions of these books. But we know, and I know this because of other scholars who've sort of surveyed the literature, there is a mountain of Kabbalistic literature out there, heavily working on systematizing Lurianic Kabbalah at this time. One of the real interesting personalities that appears in all this is Athnath Barzani. Athnath Barzani is probably the first woman rabbi that we know of, like someone who actually may have really held that title. And she was a Kabbalist, and she seems to have had supernatural powers. She lived in Kurdistan in what is now northern Iraq. And her father was very charismatic, and he died, and there was no one basically to take his place because he was just such a macher. And the only person that qualified was his daughter. And so by default, his daughter took his place, and Athnath Barzani becomes basically, I think, the world's first real female rabbi, and she is an active Kabbalist. There's a great children's book about her too, by the way. I don't know if folks have seen the children's book. It just came out recently. So there's a children's book about her. I can look it up if folks want to look at it. But it's really neat. She's just a really incredible character. She's just a really incredible character, powerful woman living in Kurdistan. And I think, again, just worth mentioning that we have one of the few women Kabbalists of this time that we can name. So I just want to make sure to name Athnath Barzani. There are two major centers that emerge in this period in the world of Kabbalah, one in Jerusalem and one in what is now Poland. What is now Poland? That's already telling you that we're sort of, the world's dividing again. Poland's going to be a center of Jewish life, of course, and Jerusalem will be as well. The first one is Beit El, the house of God, and was founded by Yemenite Kabbalists, right? We haven't talked much about Yemenite Kabbalists. There were tons of Yemenite Kabbalists. And Beit El was founded by probably one of the most erudite Kabbalists of his day. I would say he's probably the most erudite Kabbalist of his day, Shalom Mizrahi Sharabi. And Sharabi's physical school, the actual school that he taught in, survived all the way to the 1920s. It was only destroyed in an earthquake in Jerusalem. You could have gone there in the 1920s. The physical school was still there. And Kabbalists in his school were still alive as late as 1969. He had one of the longest Kabbalistic universities basically in the world. And so again, so much of the way we're taught Kabbalah is so Eurocentric, but the truth of the matter is this is a Mizrahi Jew, Yemenite Jew, running one of the longest functioning Kabbalistic schools in Jerusalem. So he died in 1777, and his Kabbalah becomes very important. Now, the main thing that they do in the school of Beit El is that it's social and it's theoretical. The first thing they do is they turn their attention exclusively to Lurianic Kabbalah. They are probably the principal systematizers of Lurianic Kabbalah in this period, the main systematizers of these ideas. And what they systematize it around is the use of kavanot. And these kavanot, I know we use the word kavanot now as kind of things to meditate upon, but in another way of thinking of kavanot, at least in this Kabbalistic sense, is to think of them as foci of spiritual concentration. Imagine one's soul as a kind of light, and that in order to gain the infinite access to the infinite light of the Godhead, you have to focus it, just like a radio wave, or any other kinds of thing. If you have unfocused energy, it doesn't do anything. It's only by focusing that energy, that focusing that spiritual energy, that you kind of get on the wavelength of God. I know it sounds super new agey, but there's a reason why they use new agey people use the metaphors they do. They're not bad metaphors. And the idea is that you have this wild energy, this wild spiritual energy, and you have to focus it, and you focus it in prayer. Prayer is the lens that focuses this energy, and that the way that you focus it, the lens of prayer is focused using these kavanot. And Sharabi's Siddur, which has been published, you can get his Siddur. It's obviously only in Hebrew, and his Siddur includes hundreds of these kavanot. And these kavanot are sort of like micro adjustments of your soul to focus your soul during prayer on various aspects of correcting and repairing and shaping your inner life, how exactly you want to connect to God or connect to the various aspects of the sefirot, how you want to comport your soul as it reaches up into the spiritual and the supernal world. And so it was through these kavanot, these very complicated kavanot, which were actually written down, and you had to memorize them. They were exams. They're kavanot exams. You had to know how to match the exams up, apparently. This was a very rigorous school of Kabbalah. But notice here again, it's about the interior life of the Kabbalist. It's not about some other stuff. It's about learning to focus your spiritual being upon God in a radically sharp, defined, in focus way. What's interesting about this school is that two things are interesting about it. One is that it was incredibly student teacher oriented, which is to say they did not teach this stuff publicly. You could not go listen to a lecture at Beit El publicly. You had to be vetted in, you had to be tested, you had to be clear, you had to have incredible levels of education to even knock on the door. So this was a school that heavily prioritized a high level of rigorous Jewish life. So this is not just sort of fly-by-night people singing songs in Ladino and being hippies. You had to rigorously apply yourself to Judaism. You had to take exams. This is Kabbalah at its most spiritually athletic. Further, you had to sign basically an NDA. You could never teach this stuff publicly. And secondly, you had to sign a kind of a letter of agreement that you pledged yourself to the school of Beit El, and that you would pledge yourself for your entire life, and you had to pledge yourself in the world to come. So you had to pledge yourself, even in the world to come, that you would only study with other members of Beit El in the world to come too, in the Beis Midrash, in Olam Haba, in the house of study in the world to come. Beit El would be there, and you had to go study there. And so even the idea here is that you had to dedicate yourself to eternity to the school. And so again, a high level of rigor. And there were people still matriculating through Beit El all the way through the early 20th century. And like I said, the last inheritor of the school of the Kavanot of Shalom Mizrahi Sharabi of blessed memory, he died in 1969. So this school lasted for centuries. The other major school appeared in Poland, right, and Brody, in what is now Poland, and this was known as the Klois. Right, the Klois. So the Klois was much more like a spiritual fraternity. It wasn't an actual school in the sense of Beit El, where you went to a place and learned. It was much more like a spiritual fraternity with various kinds of people moving through it, and more people sort of meeting in sort of a general organization of spirituality. I don't want to exactly compare it to the Freemasons, but it was something like a spiritual Kabbalistic fraternity. And it also focused heavily on Lurianic Kabbalah. Notice they're all hunkering down on Lurianic Kabbalah. That becomes the basic standard of Kabbalah for a minute. But the main thing to notice about this is it's primarily attracting Lithuanians. So those Lithuanian folks, as we'll see in a minute, are a bit more elitist and they're much more intellectualist, right? So there's a high level of intellectualist elitism going on in the Lurianic world, or in the Lithuanian world, and with some exceptions, there are definitely Poles there too. But generally speaking, this is a much more heavily intellectualist form of Kabbalah. So the Jerusalemite school is much more prayer oriented. The Polish school, the Klois, is much more intellectually oriented. They're much more interested in systematizing Kabbalah and really, really hammering out exactly a kind of systematic theology of Judaism that is basically Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, they do publish a lot of their works. We actually have a ton of works published by members of the Klois. So they did publish books. These books are very technical. I tried to look at some of them today in early Hebrew books, and I couldn't make hardly heads or tails of this stuff. You have to, the level of Kabbalistic education, the level of Talmudic education, the level of these guys is through the roof. These are geniuses who are piling this stuff on. And I was trying to read some of this stuff today. I was just like, I can't make it's like quantum mechanics. I mean, it's so high level. Their books do survive in early modern books. You can actually view them online if you want to check them out. Like I said, I really struggled to make even 10, 15 sentences make sense to me. Kind of barely could follow it. It's like, I don't know, it's like trying to, if you ever read Deleuze or, some kind of the crazy post-structuralist people, it's right reading that. Although it's that challenging. Their works are also published, but there are no translations. There are no modern editions. I don't know if they've even been reprinted since then. And you're beginning to hear a common thing now, right? They only exist at this time. They've never been reprinted and they've never been translated. The reason for that, actually, just very clearly, I'll go ahead and spoiler alert tell you, it's the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the complete cultural interruption of Kabbalah. It amputates an entire people, not just from their families, but it amputates the people from their entire world. And basically this stuff just gets abandoned. I mean, that's what happens when you flee for your life. You just can't save this stuff on the march, to these terrible camps. So much of this literature has basically become orphaned, and it's going to take 3 generations of scholars to basically bring it back into Judaism. It's going to take at least that many. It is a monumental task. And this time period, by the way, I think is probably some of the most sophisticated Kabbalistic literature ever written. And it languishes in complete obscurity because there are just so few people with the skills to bring them into modernity. The Hebrew skills, the Kabbalah skills, the Bible skills, it just doesn't exist. It just, the level of Kabbalistic scholarship of this time, 1750s, 1800, even into the 19th century, the level of Kabbalistic scholarship was so high in Central Europe that it's never recovered. It's never, ever recovered. And it's going to take 100 years, 200 years probably to recover, to get Kabbalah scholarship back up to where it was perhaps. This school is typically a bit more rationalistic. And when I say rationalistic, what I mean is they're intellectualists. For them, they're trying to systematize Kabbalah into a system of basically Jewish theology. They're trying to formulate a Jewish theology that makes sense. And for folks who know a little bit about the Litvish world, and you can probably tell I have a great deal of sympathy for the Litvish world. I'd much more heavily identify with the yeshivish Litvish world than I do the Hasidic world, although I still have a great admiration for the Hasidic world as well. But as you may know, for folks who've studied some Talmud, the famous Brisker method emerges out of the Litvish world, and the Brisker method is known to be, they compare it to balancing equations. It's like doing, it's like you ever balance chemical stuff in chemistry. It's like taking things apart at the molecular level, and so the Brisker method is infamous for its pill pull. It's nitpicking, making tiny disagreements and analyzing things in their tiny detail, as opposed to, how do we even apply all this? They don't care. They're like, no, we must very strictly understand every single logical relationship. And so this is the world that produced some of the greatest logic textbooks and Jewish logic, some of the greatest logic textbooks in halakha. The Litvish world is famous and infamous for this. And what this gives rise to is a heavily intellectualist culture and a heavily elitist culture. And as you might imagine, and again, when I say elitist, I mean that in both the good sense and the bad sense of that word. I mean that in the good sense that these are elite scholars. Again, when I say elite, I don't mean elite in just a bad way. These are the smartest, some of the smartest Jews in the world working on Judaism. They are this is the Nobel Prize winners of Judaism working in Kabbalah and stuff. Now, that also gives them a sense that they're superior. They do see that these Amcha Jews, these poor Jews, these Polish Jews working in the fields in the shtetl who barely can read and scratch together an education to read a Siddur, they do think of themselves as somehow better. Not somehow, they're better. I mean, in the same way that I think a Nobel Prize winner is going to think a high school C student in physics, they're just not going to compare. They're just not going to compare. And there is an intellectualist, and I mean this now in the negative sense, an intellectualist milieu that develops in this Litvish world, where they really do believe that, yeah, poor, illiterate, bumpkin Jews, they can do their very best and maybe they won't offend God. But can they really serve God? Can they understand God? Can they really do the heavy lifting of being a rigorous Jew? No, not really. Not really. They're never going to be really pious. They're going to have a middling piety at best, sort of a bumpkin piety. And so this intellectualist elitist trend is going to take hold in Central Europe, especially among the Litvak schools. And again, that's not for me. Again, I have a lot of sympathy for the Litvak schools, but that trend does take hold. And it's into that trend that Hasidism will emerge. Hasidism will emerge in that world. So Hasidism is an interesting kind of movement in lots of ways, obviously. The main thing that's interesting about it is that it is neither Shabbatian, although it bears a lot of similarity to Shabbatanism. We'll talk about that in a minute. So it seems to have preserved many of the attractive things that made Shabbatanism popular. So it seems to have kind of produced a Shabbatanism without Shabbatai. It has so many of the elements of Shabbatanism, but it doesn't have the kind of interior heresy of believing this guy's a Messiah. So it has all the effusion, all of the emotion, all of the passion, all of the messianic expectation, but it does not center Shabbatite's feet. It's not Shabbatian, probably. The other thing is that it doesn't go this intellectualist thing either. It doesn't go in the direction of the Klois, and it doesn't go in the direction of the Litvish world. It's a unique way of sailing in between a real difference in the Jewish world, whereas the Litvish world was very intellectualist, very elitist. It doesn't go that direction, and it doesn't go in the absolute antinomian direction of effusion and joy and do whatever you want of the Shabbatian world. It sails in between them, and unsurprisingly, it's going to be world-changing in the Jewish world. In many ways, Hasidism is, for most people at this point, just Orthodox Judaism. It will be that successful. Hasidism will be that successful. So it's begun, of course, by the mystic and practical Kabbalist. When I say practical Kabbalist, you should read something like magician. He was basically a Jewish magician. This was a thing that was practiced back at this time, was a kind of practical Kabbalah where you would make amulets and you would do mystical herbal treatments and you would do all kinds of what we would now recognize as basically Jewish magic. There was a bunch of these guys. They referred to themselves as Baal Shems, good names. And Israel ben Eliezer became known, of course, as the Baal Shem Tov. And he, and that should not say 1860s, that should say 1760s, or 1660s. He was a mystical healer. He did a lot of relatively parochial jobs. He was sort of a beadle in synagogues. He taught kids. He was never much of a person outside of the movement until he really came into his own as a kind of extraordinarily innovative and charismatic preacher of a new kind of Judaism. And this new kind of Judaism was heavily mystically involved. It involved teaching mysticism to the public, although in a very modified way. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And it was a very effusive form of Judaism. And it was a Judaism that was accessible to anyone. It was not a Judaism that was a Judaism of elite scholars. It was a Judaism that could be accessible to anyone walking along the road on a day's journey, need even mud. So the ideas of the Baal Shem Tov bring to bear all of the enthusiasm of the Shabbatian movement, but, and this is incredibly important, but a halachic rigor that anchors it into the traditional world of Jewish life. So it does the work, right? The Baal Shem Tov he squared the circle, folks. He squared the circle. He could bring the energy of the Shabbatian movement, but he could also anchor it and locate it in the world of rigorous halachic Judaism. And there's a slogan, I think, for the Hasidic movement. It's actually to be found in Tukkanei Zohar 124 or 122 base. And this is probably the most famous, I think, the basic slogan of Hasidism, right? Leis asar panui menea. That's my Yiddish accent. Late atar panui menea. So this literally means in Aramaic, there is no place devoid of God. Literally, there's no place devoid of him, but whatever. There's no place devoid of God. Everywhere is God. Everywhere is God. They say if you take the gematria of Elohim, right, and the gematria of Teva, nature, they add up to the same thing. Elohim and Teva are the same thing. God is nature. Sounds like Spinoza, a little bit like Spinoza, right? They say, look, there's no place. God cannot be anywhere other than where God is, and there can be no place devoid of God. Therefore, everywhere is where God is. Now, not everything is God. They're panentheists, not pantheists. And they say that, yes, there are things that are not God. There are all kinds of things. Everything around you is not God, but hiding underneath them all is God. There is no place where God is not. And so the thing that one must do is one must learn to focus on the imminence of God. One must uncover the reality of God all around yourself and in you. And this task is to show that God is in all being, God is in all thing, and God is in all acts. That even the task of changing the tire, the wheel on a cart in the mud, is an act of piety if you see God in it, if you find God in it. And so the idea here is that God is everywhere, and piety, the task of piety, is to uncover the divinity all around you. But God hides God's self. You never see God's face, you see God's back. And so God's back is what we see all around us. And to seek God's face in the most tiny things that you do, that is, of course, I think at the core of the Hasidic impulse. And it's a profoundly beautiful and poetic impulse. So the task is not just to follow Jewish law, but you must, because Jewish law is the primary gateway to God. But it's to realize that everything allows you to approach God. Everything that you do, everything that you are allows you to cling to God, devekus, core idea in Hasidism, that by clinging to God, by uncovering God in everything you do, the moment you take a sip of wine, the sweetness of the wine is a taste of God. That the light of the Shabbat candles, the light in the Shabbat candles is an entrance into seeing the light of God. And so that you cover your eyes before you see them for the first time in Shabbat, so that when you uncover your eyes and you see them, you may see them without the cover, the back of God. You will peer directly into the light, and there is Hashem. Right? That is Hasidism. It's just the light of the candles can reveal to you God. Everywhere is God hiding, and the process is there to find God. And ditto, of course, where can you find God the most profound? In you. Because you're made in the image of God. You're made B'Tselem Elohim. You're made in the image of God. You're a mirror of God. Everything that is you is in some sense a aspect of God. But the mirror is dirty. You have to clean the mirror. How do you clean the mirror? You undergo a process called Bitul Hayesh. And you can clean the mirror of all creation, right? The emptying out of what is. And as you empty out, as you negate what is, what's left behind from the negation of what is, the Bitul Hayesh, there's just God left. And so you purify your mind. You don't think bad thoughts. And if you do think bad thoughts, you convert the bad thoughts into good thoughts. If you see a beautiful woman walking around the road and you lust after her intensely, feel the lust. Let the lust wash over you. Feel the passion in your body. And know that the beauty and the lust that you feel for the woman walking down the road is just a pale glimpse of how much you crave to love God. Convert the feeling of the lust, of the sin, of the Avera, converted into the passion that you would have for God. So it's not about blotting out things. It's not about not feeling things. It's not about going under ascetic practices and rolling around the snow so you don't feel things. Feel it. The sin is real, and convert the sin, redeem the sin, give to the Avera a tikkun, give to the sin a reparation, and you'll elevate yourself. You'll cleanse your ego, and you'll elevate yourself through Bitul Yesh. So all of these things allow you to approach God in your everyday life. Everyday life. Everything around you hides God and is God. And you can approach those things in their physicality. So much of Kabbalah became so intellectual in the Litvish world, became so about figuring out how the Sefirot do this, and where is Ein Sof, and how does Ein Sof empty itself out with their Shimu, and what are the shards left behind, and how the shards fall to this part. It's this very complicated intellectual thing. Hasidism said what really matters for most people is that they must encounter the physical world, the world around them, the muck around them, the food they eat, the bed they sleep in, the clothes they wear. They must encounter all those things, the movement of their very body. That's where they need to find God, not as some intellectualist trying to figure out Sefirot stuff. Now, they don't abandon that, but for them, what matters is worship through embodiment, avoda b'gashmiut, right? Worship, avodah b'gashmiut, worshiping in one's physicality. That physicality is a gateway to divinity. That the body and sex, the body and eating, the body and feeling your body, even injury, can be avoda b'gashmiut, can be a way to approach Hashem and access God. So this is a radical democratization of mysticism, where everything becomes an avenue to mysticism. Everything becomes a gateway to divinity. Now, this all gets focused in on the leaders of the movement. The leaders of the movement become these incredibly charismatic, and they were just fabulously charismatic people with supernatural powers. You often hear stories of people who can look, they can see things happening for hundreds of miles away and all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of things in the Hasidic world. You got all these stories about these leaders. These leaders establish courts, dynasties. And when I say courts and dynasties, these rebbes, these tzaddikim, right? These tzaddikim, these rebbes, they live like kings. And they have the ability to intercede on your behalf of God. They're so righteous that their soul brushes up against God. And if they pray for you, then God hears. Even if they're dead, even if the Rebbe is dead and you leave letters in his grave, on his grave, his spirit, his soul can still reach up to Hashem and communicate your desire, your prayers, even beyond death. And that custom is still practiced today in the Hasidic world. These Sadokim, these rebbes, are almost divine. They're saints, basically. And you imitate everything the Rebbe does. If the Rebbe drinks a little bit of schnapps before this, you should drink a little bit of schnapps before this, because he's discovered some secret way of accessing mysticism. If he dances like this, you should dance like this. Everything the Rebbe does has some inner deep meaning, and the Rebbe is in many ways the gateway to God. So the Rebbes, the leaders of these Hasidic dynasties, become quasi-divine figures in many, many ways. And these courts get established all through Eastern Europe, and they are fabulous. You're talking about dudes wearing hats that cost thousands of gold coins. You're talking about guys wearing silver garments that are like knit through with gold and silver thread. Because again, your very clothing is a gateway to God, and the more beautiful you are, the more you glorify yourself. Of course, at some level, it helps you to be more connected to God, because God's a king. Then maybe you should be a bit like a king too. And so the outfits that they wear, and to this day, the outfits they wear can cost tens of thousands of dollars for a coat, tens of thousands, $40,000, $50,000 for a hat, because it's all about the glory, the kavod of the Rebbe. So they established these courts, and these courts go on to become the central pillars of the Hasidic movement, even to this day. So you probably know some of these courts. Satmar, the Satmar court, which is now split between two brothers who've had a nasty dispute since the former Rebbe of the Satmar died. The Satmar movement is the biggest. If you saw Unorthodox, if folks saw Unorthodox, the television show, that depicts the Satmar dynasty. Probably folks know the Chabad-Lubavitch movement. Chabad is a philosophy of Hasidism. Lubavitch is the actual dynasty. The Lubavitch movement is primarily known for its kiruv, which is to say outreach. They are a very outward-looking Hasidic movement that wants to bring people into Judaism, and they want to bring people into Judaism because that's part of how they do that's how they're going to redeem the world. Of course, they're also known for their at least some section of them in their belief that their late Rebbe, or Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory, was the Messiah. Which I've been to his grave, where he's buried out in Queens a couple times, and yeah, it's a very powerful spiritual experience to pray there at the grave of the Rebbe. There's also a Rebbe's grave here in Detroit. If you ever get the chance to visit one, there's a Rebbe's grave here. He was what was Bells? Maybe the Bells Hasidim? I can't remember exactly, but he died here. He just happened to be visiting here and died, and they buried him here. And now it's a pilgrimage site. And going to visit the graves of the Rebbe is a big deal in the Hasidic world. Nachman of Breslov, if you go to the Breslov tomb, certain times of the year, they ship in tens of thousands of Hasidim all over the world that invade this Ukrainian town for like a weekend. So it's a big deal there. Now, what's important to know about these Hasidic Rebbes is that they weren't just enthusiastic, charismatic leaders who relied on emotions and enthusiasm to rope people in. These are systematic thinkers. Many of them were carefully systematic thinkers, and they produced some of the most innovative texts of Kabbalah of that time. Now, are they as rigorous as what's coming out of the Litvak school? No. Are they as intensely focused as what's coming out of Beit El over in Jerusalem? No. But they are systematic treatises on Kabbalah from the point of view of Hasidism, which seeks to make Kabbalah something that you live. It's a thing that you live. It's a thing that you experience. It's a thing that you embody. And so it's not, in many ways, the kind of highly intellectualist Kabbalah that existed in the Lithuanian world. It's a much more livable kind of Kabbalah. And of course, the most famous book of this form of Kabbalah is the Tanya, which is something like scripture, basically, for the Lubavitch movement. You can get a copy of the Tanya anywhere. I mean, you can go anywhere. There's a Chabad Lubavitch place and ask them for a copy of the Tanya. They will happily give you a copy of the Tanya. It's a little bit controversial because it claims that basically non-Jews don't have souls. They do a lot of acrobatics to try to explain that away, but it has some pretty famously infamous parts. But the Tanya is probably the most famous book but there are tons of Kabbalistic text written in the Hasidic world, and never let anyone tell you that they lack intellectual or spiritual rigor. That's simply a lie, I think, perpetuated by people that I typically actually sympathize with, but it's simply not true. These books are incredibly deep and incredibly powerful forms of Kabbalah. Now, as you might imagine, this faced enormous kickback from the non-Jewish world. They had just dealt with the Shabbatites fiasco, and you got people doing damn headstands during prayer as part of their Avodah B'Gashmiut. They're like, you people are out of control. You're just Shabbatians, right? You're just all crypto Shabbatians. You're bringing all the stuff that led us into perdition with Shabbatites V. You need to stop. And they were led by the Gaon of Vilna. And the Gaon of Vilna was a vociferous opponent of the Hasidic movement. The Lithuanian schools typically became referred to as misnagdim, the opponents, right? And typically, sometimes I'm kind of misnagd in my personality and misnagd in my Judaism, which is funny because I have lots of Hasidic friends, and it's, the joke is that, I'm more misnagd and they're more Hasidic, obviously, but this was a brutal feud that raged for a couple of generations. And I will say that, in all honesty, the Misnagdim aren't completely wrong here, folks. The early generations of the Hasidic movement, the first couple of generations of the Hasidic movement, were pretty out of control. or pretty out of control, especially, again, you have to think about this in the aftermath of the Shabbatai Tzvi thing. They are terrified that it's going to go off the rails again. They're going to get one of these Rebbe's to pop off and say they're Messiah, and we're going to have to deal with the exact same disaster again. And I've gone through some of these already in a previous talk, but you can begin to see the Mishnah perspective, that the tzaddik looks kind of like a little Messiah, right? The Rebbe looks a bit like a little Messiah. That there's sort of a transgression for the sake of heaven angle here. That there's kind of like that you have to experience the sin of lust, and you have to convert it to God. You should feel lust, and then you convert it to feel lust for God, love for God. These Mishnayim are like, no, don't feel lust. That's Yetzer Hara. Why would you cultivate the feeling of lust? You cannot do that. You cannot convert it. You need to minimize that feeling, not feel it and then convert it. And so they worried that this was a kind of the cultivation of averas, of sins. Both of these movements have emerged in Podolia. There's no denying that. Both the Hasidic movement and the Shabbati movement in Europe emerged from the exact tiny region of Poland. And many people thought, you grow from the same earth, it's the same thing. Also, they are popularizing Kabbalah. Remember, right? Books like the Tanya by Shneur Zalman of Liadi, blessed memory, they are trying to bring Kabbalah back to the masses. That's one of the things that the Kabbalists at this time are trying to stop. They're like, no, these people were led astray by these ideas, not because the ideas are bad, and maybe not because the people are inherently not incapable of understanding them. They just can't understand them with their level of education. You cannot communicate these ideas to these people because it will go off the rails again. Hasidism says no. You bring them along and you educate them. You teach them. You give them a little bit at a time until you raise them up until they can become understanding of these matters. So there's a much higher degree of willingness on the part of the Hasidic world to incorporate Kabbalistic ideas into their connection to the masses. That deeply worries the establishment, especially in Europe. They worry about avodah bagashmu. They really worry that this is also just antinomianism. It's people doing weird stuff, doing handstands and cartwheels during prayer, people screaming during prayer. One of the Hasidic dynasties that exists is the Karliners. The Karliners are the most metal of all of the Hasidic people. They're the most metal because they're infamous for screaming all of their prayers out loud. So if you ever go to a Karliner shul, which I have been, they just scream their prayers during the prayer cycle. You can imagine for a bunch of heady, intellectual, university-trained Jewish Kabbalists, a bunch of dudes screaming all the time, crying uncontrollably. They're like, these people are crazy. This is the Shabbatanism again, right? So avodah bagashmiut early on was very worrying for this. The court setting with these Rebbe's acting like kings. Shabbatai Tzvi did that when he was in Migdal Oz. He did that when he was in exile, Montenegro, what is now Montenegro. They're just being little Shabbatais. These Rebbe's are just being little Shabbatais. They're just little messiahs, and many of them thought they might be the Messiah. And that's an idea we'll get to when we get to the 20th century with the rise of Messianism and the Chabad Lubavitch movement. They were terrified one of these guys would pop off and declare themselves a Messiah. Further, some Shabbatian books were popular among early Hasidim. Hamdat Yamim was a big one, right? But there were other crypto Shabbatian books that were popular among early Hasidim. So the way the Mitnagdim saw the Hasidic movement, at least early on, was that if it's not Shabbatinism, it's diet Shabbatinism. It's Shabbatinism light. It's Shabbatinism that has all of the same dangerous ingredients that could lead to the problems we just had. It's just not there yet. And so they were terrified of this movement. And they were terrified of the movement both because they wanted to maintain the integrity of Judaism, but also because they were terrified of what could happen if the Shabbatian thing popped off again, if there were another one. And again, I know it's easy to kick the Mitnagdim as this sort of like intellectualists, I don't know, fogies or whatever. They were trying to shepherd a movement in the aftermath of a disaster, a spiritual disaster. And the last thing they wanted was the ingredients of that disaster becoming popular again. Now, what's happening and what's incredibly important, and I think that this is what makes obviously proof of, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting or whatever. the Hasidic movement was ultimately not Shabbatian, and I don't think it was Shabbatian in the beginning. And how do we know that? In a generation or two, it became very rigorously halakhically conservative. To this day, if you go to a Hasidic synagogue, they are halakhic as the day is long. Now they have weird halakhic stuff. They follow a different minhag than Litvak people. They follow a much more Sephardi style minhag, which is odd because they're in Central Europe. They might put tefillin on during Kol Moed, which is unusual. It's a specifically Kabbalistic thing and found in, and I think in most of the Hasidim. I don't think the Lubavitch people do it. So they do some unusual things, but at the end of the day, it's a halakhically conservative movement. They come down the side of the old school Kabbalah, which was Jewish law is the unique gateway to God. And rigorous following of the law of the halakha is a fundamental aspect of Kabbalah. So for all of the excesses, for all of the court, for all of the tzaddiks, for all the rebbes, for all of the unusual stuff they may do, for all the cartwheels they might do during prayer, screaming things and whatever, at the end of the day, the law is the law and they don't break it. Both sides of this equation, both the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim, they spent generations excommunicating. I think they excommunicate each other like every week or so. It was just a dreadful situation. I think local authorities had to intervene on several occasions and things like this. Also, I should point this out in the defense of Hasidim, again, because I identify more the Mitnag world. I will say that the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was one of the Talmudists that actively opposed the Frankist movement. So from the very beginning, they were opposed to things like Frankism. The Besht was, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, was opposed to it. So again, he was in the pro-Talmud camp, he taught Talmud, etc. So I just want to, again, we all have our biases. I want to name my bias. I'm much more pro the Litvak world. And I also want to make sure that I'm not ever misrepresenting the richness, the genius, and the deep spiritual power of the Hasidic movement, and to make it very clear that while I'm saying that there is a link at some level with the Hasidic world and the Shabbatian world, I think that link is homologous, not one of common ancestry, and not one in which the Hasidic world was a crypto-Shabbatian movement. I do not believe that. I'm not attributing that to them. I want to make that very clear, because I don't want to appear as if I'm slandering Hasidic people, because I don't want to ever appear to be doing that. I've learned in Hasidic yeshivot, like, trust me, I have a deep respect for these folks. Hasidism would go on to become one form of Orthodox Judaism. In fact, if you've probably encountered Orthodox Judaism, you've probably encountered it through Hasidism. I bet everyone here who's Jewish has encountered Chabad at some level. And if you have, you've encountered Hasidism. Now, they're the most outwardly looking of the Hasidic world. And if you ever learn Kabbalah, it's very likely you've learned it in a Hasidic environment. You've probably learned Hasidic interpretations of Kabbalah. That form of Kabbalah proved very popular. It filtered down all the way into Jewish practice and belief. So Hasidism has proved decisive in Jewish history. Now, other high-level Kabbalah, more academic, more intellectualist Kabbalah would continue to go on in the Litvak world all the way till now. My understanding is it's still going on. I don't know much about it, but it's still going on. Further, Lurianic Kabbalah, it would stick, especially Lurianic Kabbalah as taken up by Chaim Vital. Why? Why is there no further significant development in Kabbalah following Luria? And the answer is Shabbatai Tzvi. I think everyone after Shabbatai Tzvi was so gun-shy of major innovation in Kabbalah that they de facto settled on Luria. They more or less said, this is it. We're not going to change this. We're not going to muck around with it. We will continue to systematize it. We will continue to adopt it. We'll continue to adapt it. We'll modernize it. We'll systematize it with Cordovero. We'll turn it round and round. But Lurianic Kabbalah is it. I think that there was no major Kabbalistic innovation, systematic innovation after Luria, because I think that there was such a shell shock after the Shabbatai disaster. So Lurianic Kabbalah won. And all Kabbalah basically that exists now is some species of Lurianic Kabbalah. So he won. We are all living in the shadow of Luria. And again, I think that the reason why there's never been another new kind of Kabbalah after Luria basically is because of the shell shock of Shabbatanism. But as you might imagine, there's a dark cloud on the horizon, right? And depending on how you view it, it might be a dark cloud, or it might be the clouds finally parting. It could be a dark cloud because what you might see coming is rationalism. What you might see coming is logic. What you might see coming is modernity, what strips the world of all spirituality and subjects it to a law of mechanism and logic, mathematics and science, and it robs the world of spirituality. That might be the dark cloud that you see coming. If you see something else, you might look at the same thing and see something completely different. You might see the clouds of darkness finally parting after 1,000 years of darkness, of mysticism, of random speculation about a world that no one has access to, a world of backwardness and superstition, a world where people believe in all kinds of nonsense that they can't prove. And you might see the clouds parting and the sun shining through in the form of logic and math and science and modernity. And if you're on team B, then the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, is your buddy. Because what's about to happen is that the Enlightenment is tearing through Europe and the non-Jewish world. And it's making enormous strides. The Industrial Revolution is beginning. Huge gains are being made in human rights. Right? This is the time period of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. There is a huge impulse at this point in the non-Jewish world towards science, towards math, towards logic. In the Jewish world in Central Europe, there are some Jews who are beginning to look out and see, I think that the non-Jews may be onto something. And they begin to engage in the Jewish version of that Enlightenment process, the Enlightenment of Newton, the Enlightenment of Kant. Again, the same year that Shabbatates V apostatized is the same year that Newton invented calculus, discovered the fundamental nature of light, and wrote his main book on physics. That shows you how the world's so different. Shabbatai is apostatizing in Turkey, and Newton is fundamentally unlocking the secrets of physics, light, and math. And by the time we get to the 1700s, the Jewish Enlightenment is beginning to take effect. The Haskalah will begin to take effect. And what we're going to see is that in the aftermath of the Haskalah, which we'll talk about next time, the arrival of Enlightenment values in Judaism, that we're going to see a huge shift in Kabbalah. The 19th and 20th centuries will represent both an incredible loss in the Kabbalistic world, and I mean a loss, I mean the loss of life, the Holocaust, of course, but also the rebirth of Kabbalah. The fact that we're having this conversation right now means something's changed. We are modern Jews for whom most of us would be declared heretics by the very people we've been studying for the past 15 weeks. All of us would have been condemned, probably. Many of us would never have been allowed to study Kabbalah if you're not Jewish according to their rules, or if you're not Jewish at all. We are, in some level, the inheritors of what's about to change. And what we're going to see is the interesting travails of Kabbalah into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, where it will undergo some of the most horrifying defeats, and it will rise from those ashes. And some of the most important Kabbalistic texts are now available within the last 5 years. Something like the Zohar and the Pritzker edition are now available to us. So next time, folks, we're going to turn our attention to the 19th, 20th, and 21st century to talk about the sort of vicissitudes of Kabbalah in the aftermath of the last major Kabbalistic innovation, of course, was Hasidism. And we'll talk about sort of the post-Hasidic world. What does the world in the aftermath of the Hasidic world, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, with the rise of the internet, with the rise of liberal Judaism, how does Kabbalah adapt, can reconfigure itself, and survive in all of those environments? And as you know, because you're listening to the sound of my voice talking about Kabbalah, you know that the story is a happy one. Kabbalah survives and thrives. And we'll talk about that process and its vicissitudes next week as we wrap up this class. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and Hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.